Welcome by this session about Capgemini and generative AI. My name is Clemens 𝗬𝗂𝗂. I'm part of the Capgemini group and I'm the Chief Technology and Capability Leader. When I talk about generative AI and Capgemini, we leverage all aspects of what happens around generative AI in enterprises. So we have 4 areas where we are focusing us on. And definitely there will be more in the near future. First, custom generative AI for enterprises. With custom generative AI for enterprises, we solve the challenges what enterprises have with more generic, with the open large language models which are out there, by making them more specific. And we're doing this together with Microsoft and what we call it the Azure Intelligent App Factory. Then for sure we also have generative AI for software engineering. And leveraging for our own teams, leveraging for our customer teams to make the productivity of developers optimal. And definitely this is in the area where you see GitHub Copilot and Copilot X are flourishing. And then you have also other areas, like for customer experience, generative AI for customer experience. That's where you see capabilities from Microsoft like M365 Copilot, but also the Dynamics 365 with Copilot and the Sales Copilot starting to create their own capabilities there. All this is based on a foundation where we are helping enterprises with their generative AI strategy. Now when you look at Capgemini and the relationship what we already hold with Microsoft for more than 25 years. It's a very strong and innovative partnership there. We are working 25 years together with more than 2,000 joint customers what we are going towards together. And also we have proven our practices, proven our capabilities with advanced specializations, where we also around data and AI have our advanced specializations proven to an external auditor that we are capable of running these enterprise-grade generative AI solutions. And also quite recently we renewed for the 4th time in a row with 100 out of 100 for our expert MSP certification. And then when you look what kind of awards and recognitions we get from Microsoft and also from our partners, it is huge there. And this is also what we are leveraging with our AI capabilities. So we are building up more and more generative AI use cases for all kinds of different industries. And this is also where we are leveraging the partnership with Microsoft to the max. And we are innovating together, we are partnering together, and we are building everything on top of Azure. So let me focus on the Azure Intelligent App Factory. Because the Azure Intelligent App Factory helps to make those generative AI solutions, those intelligent business functionality, get it happen into the cloud. And getting it into the hands of the business. So that they really can feel what the value is of these kinds of generative AI solutions specific for their own business. And this is definitely what you see, and there's a lot of talk about at this moment, where executives are talking about generative AI and how it can bring a real value to my business results. And that's definitely all organizations are talking about this at this moment, and it's a top of mind with many industries. It's always interesting when you're starting to talk about those kinds of business results, business value out of generative AI. All kinds of use cases are popping up. But it's always quite difficult what is now the generative AI part of it. Because many solutions, many use cases also have just basic AI solutions in there. They have data, they have normal capabilities, which you also find in all kinds of applications already. And I always say when it's a use case specific for generative AI, is when it generates something. When it generates some piece of text, a piece of report, a summary, a piece of code, a nice image, a video, that is when it's called generative AI. And generative AI is actually learned based on the patterns what we are using into our natural language. So it learned that all together, and then it can start predicting what will be the next one, what will be the next word, what will be the next sentence in this flow of words what I'm going to generate for you. And for natural languages, you can imagine this much more difficult, because when we talk, we have our own slang, we have our own words. But generative AI learned from so many sources what is the next most logical word after this one, that it can generate some real human understanding content. And on the developer side, it is much more efficient, because there is already some quite strong grammatics behind programming languages. So, and that's why you see for developer tools, for coding languages, the generative AI really brings some quite strong value there also. But when you are talking with enterprises, they see some challenges. Challenges with the normal generic generative AI models which are out there. There are challenges around, it's quite generic actually. It's the outcome which comes from the open source large language models are not specific for my business. I want to make it more specific, better outcomes which are focusing on my business there. And that's also what you see happening is when you are starting to work with these open source large language models where people are just starting to use it, it gets quite uncontrollable. And definitely uncontrollable, and compliance officers, security officers, they are getting an uncomfortable feeling, and they are getting the risk around IP infringements and all those kinds of security aspects which can harm the company there. And they say that, okay, wind down, keep on, be careful when you use it. And don't share any company information to the large language model, actually, to the open APIs, for example. You don't want to send, hey, these are my half-year results, create a nice graph from it, and then send that to the public, and that information is reused for training the model. That's not what you want to have. So you want to have that security boundary in there. But also when you are using inside your organization, how do you know that it can scale? How do you know that I can give it to all my employees and that they really gain that benefit from it? So these are often the challenges what organizations feel when it is behind generative AI. And that's where you need to bring some solutions to it, to make those generative AI solutions business specific. They need to use the content of the business. It needs to have a strong collaboration, strong integration with existing applications within the environment. It needs to be in a secure environment. So really make those generative AI solutions business specific and also business compliant in the secure boundary of the organization. And this is actually what we are doing with our Azure Intelligent App Factory. We are using the data from the business, we are running it on a safe haven, on a safe platform, and we are making that intelligence business specific. So you really get the outcomes what you are expecting from generative AI. And that's what we call the Azure Intelligent App Factory. The Azure Intelligent App Factory has actually these three items embedded in it. What we call the digital industry platforms. Those are the platforms which are the safe haven for your intelligent business functionality. And when you are talking cloud, it is quite obvious. It's about landing zones, it's about cloud foundation. You have specific policies already in place so that you can always prove you are compliant to any regulator requirements there. But also you have already built in some pieces of functionality which can be reused quite easily for all the industries and making it a very efficient platform to start building up that intelligent business functionality. For example, data is one important aspect there. Microsoft, for example, announced and Microsoft built Microsoft Fabric. Microsoft Fabric is a data platform which can be used to train the models and to add the intelligence, that information, what is needed for that intelligence to the environment there. And that's also what we are putting into those platforms to make it ready to be used. And that ready to be used is done by the industry assistants. And the industry assistants, as Microsoft would call them, co-pilots. At Capgemini we call them industry assistants. We are making the generic generative AI solution business specific. We can do that on 3 different ways. And that's what we are starting to build up around practices, knowledge, assets in those intelligent factory. The first one is prompt orchestration. And prompt orchestration is quite easy way to start. And I see many use cases and also many enterprises already start working with prompt orchestration. It's actually is that you are using the default large language model, the default open API large language model. You're putting it into Azure, for sure, into the secure environment, and starting to ask it questions. But what we are doing, we are adding to that question the business context. And think about when I ask something about, give me the financial report about this company. When it is into the public, maybe getting it from Bloomberg or any other report or market organization. But when I'm asking that question in the context of my company, maybe it goes to SAP, gets that information, adds it to the question of the business, create a report about with this data, and then the large language model generates that report for me, or that summary, or the nice graph for me. So the prompt orchestration is adding the context of the business into the question. It requires connection with data sources, with integration components, and that's where normal developers are actually quite comfortable with. You only need to add some very specific knowledge around the domain of the business. The second one, where you are making generic large language models, generic generative AI solutions business specific, is when you are starting to tune the foundational large language model, the basic large language model, tune it with specific business data. You can imagine it requires a lot of amount of data. But because you only are retraining a small part of the large language model, the retraining is not that expensive as retraining the whole model. And when you are adding that specific business information to the large language model, also the answers, the generated reports, the generated text are specific for your business. And the performance is quite well actually. And then we have the third one. And the third one is that you are starting to use different kinds of large language models. Large language models which are business specific or industry specific. Probably everybody knows the Bloomberg GPT large language model with specific market information, and that's what you can add to Azure, and then using that large language model to start asking questions, and you'll get industry specific answers back. There are many more of those kinds of large language models out there which are specifically trained on certain industries, on certain capabilities. For example, recently Microsoft at Microsoft Ignite announced that also Llama, the large language model, is also coming from Meta, from Facebook owner. They are making that available into Azure. And that's also what our teams are doing. They are assessing all the open source, all the public available large language models, assessing them on the quality, and then making them available for our teams to start using for your projects. And because we are promising actually, that we are bringing this intelligent business functionality into production, you not only need to have those industry assistants, you don't need only the industry platforms, you also need to have teams which are building it to either inside an existing application and next to an existing business functionality or complete new business functionality. And those are our teams which having those DevOps practices, they have their MLOps practices, they have the reliable AI engineering practices embedded in there to take care that intelligence gets into the hands of the business. To make this really touchable, we have a proof of value. A proof of value what we can execute in 3 weeks. And that first proof of value is that we are proving that the business sees the value of prompt orchestration. We are working together with your business to define a use case, or maybe select a use case, use your data, and starting it to bring it in the hands of the business so that they can test with it, they can work with it, and they can really get that inspiration to start going there. And with this prompt orchestration, we say we can do it in 3 weeks with a certain amount of people, and that's definitely where you have the domain expertise needed also. Definitely a more complex proof of value is when you are starting to work with your data. Working with the large language model to tune it with your own data. We're working with our own experts, but that's why we need some more people with some deep learning expertise, and also with some data engineers to make that data available and ready to start consuming by that large language model and retrain and train that large language model, and having the right practices in place so that your business can see, okay, what happens when I do large language model fine-tuning. And when the business is confident, they've seen the value, they've seen the capabilities, what all happens around there, then we were using our capability to scale this throughout the whole organization. An enterprise-grade generative AI solution, where we are using capabilities of the Intelligent App Factory, the Azure Intelligent App Factory, to give it in the hands of the business everywhere, and that more and more use cases are popping up, and that we are starting in control and staying in control. What happens when people are starting to use and see the value of these kinds of generative AI use cases and capabilities into the organization. And definitely based on the scale of the organization and readiness assessments, compliancy, all kinds of activities need to start happening there. That's why we're starting with an onboarding, a readiness for scaling up activity there. And when I talked about those use cases, we started to discuss with many of our industry leaders and also industry leaders of Microsoft, what are now the most interesting use cases for certain industries to start leveraging there. And that's what we captured in this small use case catalog framework, where we have in the swim lanes the different industries, and then in the different rows, what can you accomplish, for example, with prompt orchestration in financial services? What can you accomplish with large language model fine-tuning in manufacturing? And what can you accomplish when you are rolling it out through your whole organizations? And this is what our teams are doing at this moment. They are starting to implement these kinds of use cases for themselves, just to see and taste the value of it, but also definitely together with customer and business teams of the customer there. And one example is for example, Alstom, and where we are using digital information services to enable the organizations to grow around the capabilities around generative AI. Thank you for listening in. My name is Clemens Reijnen. Feel free to reach out to me whenever time you have a question.